If you are someone who wants to understand, predict, and perhaps even influence the trajectory of modern politics, it's important that you have at least a high-level understanding of a very important ongoing civil war within Christianity. While there are many theological conflicts within Christianity at any given time, this one, which is perhaps I think the most fundamental, is already having a determinative effect on the trajectory of right-wing politics. There are two sides in this civil war. We'll call them the moderates and the conservatives. These two sides are waging a war over the true meaning of a particular story in the Bible, the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. The canonical story is told in 3 different books, Mark, Luke, and John. In each book, the story is no more than a dozen verses. Here is the story from the Gospel of John. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Even if you've never opened a Bible in your life, you can tell that this story of Jesus is very different from the love thy enemy and turn the other cheek version of Jesus that most people are familiar with. The key thing to realize is that this story is the front line of the mimetic civil war between the moderates and conservatives within Christianity. And depending on whose interpretation gets to dominate in the culture, it has a lot of implications for politics as well as just the lives of individual Christians. If Christians are called to imitate Jesus, does that mean imitating his behavior in the temple? This is a very old theological debate, but it's being played out more and more in public. Here's Andrew Isker, a conservative Christian, discussing this story with Tucker Carlson.
Right. Well, Jesus is in the temple, and he's fighting with the chief priests, and he's telling them, he's fighting with them at Passover. So thousands of people surrounding them. He's embarrassing them in the temple. And
his boldness is really shocking.
Yes.
To people who haven't read it before.
Yes.
The rage that he displays at the leadership,
yes,
the religious leadership, is just like it's
nothing else.
It comes right off the page.
And which is so ironic because you see evangelicals who are like, you need to be more Christ-like, right? You need to be, which means like wimpy and weak and inoffensive.
Sweeping into the temple and knocking over tables and driving people out with a whip. But talk about speaking truth to power. I mean, I don't know how that Jesus was kept for me as a lifelong churchgoer. I have no idea.
Now, on the contrary, here is Reverend Chris Gordon, who explains the more moderate interpretation of this story.
I find myself frustrated at moments too, because then you got the opposite side of the spectrum here. It's like, let me read Calvin on that. He says, at the same time, we must be aware lest any man transgress the bounds of his calling. All right. All of us ought to have zeal in common with the Son of God, but we are not at liberty to seize a whip that we may correct vices with our hands, for we have not received the same power, nor have we been entrusted with the same commission. So in terms of, fighting air with a spiritual warfare, spiritual violence, most certainly. But there are a lot of people who are just flat out obnoxious with their convictions and who do great damage in the church using a passage. I mean, I heard from, lots of people this verse quoted to just bang people over the head because everyone else is compromised.
Wow.
So the moderate interpretation of this story is that because Jesus is sinless, he's the Son of God, he's one of the few people who's actually allowed to pick up a whip and use it because his anger is always righteous by definition. If let he who is without sin cast the first stone is the operative rule, then Jesus is literally the only person who's actually allowed to cast a stone and pick up the whip. But conservatives say here Jesus modeled a type of righteous aggression that actually is required of Christians to imitate when the circumstances call for it. And here's why this is so important. If you take the moderate interpretation of the story to be correct, the underlying moral philosophy that emerges from that is one that's going to have implications for not only how you live your own life, but how you vote in, the political realm. The moderate perspective might be one that says it's wrong to use the force of law to impose Christian morality on others. Whereas the conservative interpretation would say, no, it's entirely warranted to use the force of law to impose a particular morality that God deems as being righteous. Here's Democratic politician and Christian pastor James Tallarico giving his interpretation. interpretation.
You talked about how Jesus entered into the seat of power and started flipping over tables of injustice. And you said it's time for us to start flipping tables as well. Your use of that text is different than the way I hear it used on the religious right. How would you say it's different? Because one of the things that caught my attention is I hear that text being used on the religious right sometimes to weaponize the faith or to justify sometimes flat out aggression towards political enemies. It came up a lot leading up to January 6th in 2021.
Yeah.
Why is your use of that story different than the way a MAGA Christian nationalist would use that story?
Well, I mean, there's all the moral difference in the world between Jesus's act of civil disobedience and protest in the temple and the violent insurrection on January 6th. One was nonviolent, the other one certainly wasn't.
Now, here's why this particular theological dispute has so much relevance to modern politics. Every Sunday, tens of millions of Americans attend their church and listen to the sermon given by their priest or pastor. Just looking at that number alone, we can see that the cultural power that these theological influencers have rivals that of social media, the US education system, Hollywood, etc. If you go inside any random church, any given priest or pastor is going to have a more moderate or more conservative interpretation of this story. And when it comes to theological issues, most parishioners just imitate the beliefs of their priest or pastor of the church they happen to go to. Priests and pastors are at the front end of the meme adoption curve. They engage in complex theological studies and debates about different biblical interpretations, disputes between church fathers, and so on. Then they translate the ideas or memes they derive from these studies into actionable sermons that their parish receives on Sunday. So depending on who makes the more compelling theological case for the proper interpretation of the story of Jesus in the temple, a significant number of priests and pastors in the United States might begin to adopt that framing and then translate that directly to their parishes and the church attendees. The moral lesson from that story, whether it be the moderate or conservative version, would then inform how people vote. If you can understand how a small number of professors or educators can eventually influence millions by influencing a small number of people, you can see that the cultural and political destiny of the right is very much caught up in who has the proper interpretation of this very controversial story in the Bible. Most people recognize that politics is downstream from culture, but the truly insightful understand that culture is downstream from theology. Until next time, good luck and Godspeed.